A lot of people are afraid of needles. It's a pretty common fear. I wouldn't say I'm the worst to deal with it. I don't have raging panic attacks, and I've never fainted. But I do work up my anxiety pretty significantly before I have to go get one. And I almost always streak my face with a tear or two as soon as I see the needle. Sometimes before it even comes anywhere near me. I could even work myself into a mild panic attack the day before if I don't have anything to distract me during the day. It's especially bad in the evening, when all my brain can do is play out scenarios of how terrible the next day is going to be over and over again in my head. I remember when I was a kid, there was a mandatory shot we had to get. I cried silently behind the permission slip the teacher had deposited on my desk to take home, and cried every night for a week until the day. I was miserable. I'm better with needles now that I'm older. I'm an adult now, and there are some things you just force yourself to do, even if you don't want to, and it's usually better to just get it over with. I still get a bit emotional and stressed, but I'm pretty conscious of the doctor or nurse who's doing it. It's not their fault I have to get a needle, and I don't want to make their job harder than it probably already is. I try to stay as still as I can and not tense up. I prompt them ahead of time that I'm scared and won't be actively talking to them, and usually the procedure goes smoothly, even if I end up a bit of a mess. I have trouble even pinpointing what part of the experience triggers me. I know sometimes it's necessary. I know in my mind, logically, it doesn't even hurt. I trust most medications, and I know that serious side effects are rare. So it's not even the after effects. It's just something about the way the needle is so small and innocent. But once you feel it pierce through your skin and inject something into your body, it feels a little violating. Just the overall experience of getting a needle triggers me on a visceral level, and I can't really control the anxiety and emotional reaction I have to it. If I absolutely need to get a needle, I'll do it. But if it's up to my discretion, often I'll refuse. The only exception I made recently was for an optional vaccination, but that was because I more predominantly refused to be lumped in with the anti-vaxxers that were plaguing the internet at the time. I suffered through that shot like a champ. Priorities, you know. Get your vaccines, kids. Unfortunately, this is my only experience with tiny needles like vaccines, and blood-drawing needles are another story entirely. I once had a meltdown in a doctor's office several years ago because I wasn't prepared for her to suggest I get blood work done. My terror and anxiety kicked into high gear, and I immediately burst into tears and told her I wouldn't do it. I went home an emotional mess that day, and it was an embarrassing ordeal. I mentally brace myself ahead of time now, so I don't freak out if they happen to suggest it. It's not the end of the world, and usually it's optional, so I don't have to get it done anyway. It hasn't been absolutely necessary for me to get my blood drawn since I was very young. I don't even remember it, but according to my parents, I did get blood work done at one point. Whether that was because I was too young to remember, or because I purposely blocked the experience from my brain, I'll never know. A while back, my doctor wanted me to get a blood test done for some random strain of measles or something. Just in case, they said. I took the paperwork to be polite, and after a week of it sitting on my desk, I threw it out, knowing I wouldn't be able to convince myself to go. It wasn't very adult of me, but I couldn't justify a tiny what if for an experience that would grant me significant emotional misery for very little payoff. This week, I went to the clinic with an odd pain in my chest, I have a few different diseases on my father's side of the family, thyroid and diabetes. And though I thought it was probably just stress from a hard work week and an upcoming project I needed to prepare for, I went to get it checked out anyway. The doctor at the clinic was stumped, prodding at the area where the muscle throbbed dully. It didn't hurt much, but it was odd that it seemed to be aching for no particular reason. He nodded along as I briefly stated my family medical history, and I mentioned that I didn't recall straining it in any way either. After a few strange tests, testing my vision and feeling around on my neck, I figured he must be checking for either of those diseases that ran in my family. As he left my side and wandered over to his computer, tapping away and entering a few notes, I braced myself. I knew what was coming. I haven't had any symptoms of thyroid or diabetes my whole life, but I knew if he was thinking about it at that moment, what it entailed. Here's a form to go get a blood test. These checked boxes just tell us how many vials they need to get. Most of these are checking for thyroid, but we'll check your blood for glucose as well, just in case. I'm not exactly sure what's causing it, but the test will hopefully shine some light on our next steps. The lab is just down the road. You know where it is? He asked, his attention more directed towards the computer than to me. Yeah, I know where it is, I muttered, a tinge of defeat and bitterness hanging off my words. This didn't sound optional. I took the paperwork and climbed into my car. It sat on the passenger seat, staring at me. I didn't drive to the lab. I drove home. I called my regular doctor and asked her to forward me the paperwork from several months ago, telling the secretary that I'd lost it and I was going to get some other blood work done. I figured if I had to go, I'd get everything that everyone wanted done and out of the way. 2 birds with 1 stone. Plus, if the secretary forgot about my request and didn't send me the paperwork, I could use that as an excuse to not go and get it done at all. Unfortunately, the paperwork was sitting in my email the next morning. I sighed, printing it out and glancing at the time. Early afternoon seemed like a decent time to go. It was midweek and shouldn't be too busy around lunchtime. I steeled myself and hopped in the car, driving over to the labs. I could feel the ache in my jaw from clenching it, and I tried to manually relax myself by breathing slowly on the way over. I couldn't do very much about my heartbeat, which I could feel thumping through my veins at an uncomfortable speed. The anxiety rose up in my throat like bile, but I managed to fight it back most of the way. I arrived at the labs and wandered in, scanning the waiting room. One old woman in a bright pink shirt, a tattooed couple with colourful hair, and 2 rambunctious children. I nervously stepped up and answered the questions of the secretary, her words settling my anxiety momentarily with a distraction. I handed over my paperwork and health card. Might as well do it all at once, because I don't do this very often. I smiled at the woman tightly. She seemed sympathetic, realizing my stress. "It'll be all right," she hummed reassuringly. I sat down to wait and tried to not look at how much time I had on the TV, showing the waiting list order. I could feel my anxiety creeping up the back of my neck once again. The 2 children were misbehaving, one screeching and the other trying to walk into the rooms where others were taking their turns. The old woman was piping up every few minutes, asking when it was her turn and if she was indeed there to get her blood work and not something else. The nurses patiently told her it would only be a bit longer. The noise didn't help my stress levels, and I opened up a game on my phone to try and occupy my mind with something else. I only checked the waiting list once, and the 10 minutes message behind my name spiked my anxiety so hard I had to slip into the washroom and drink some water from the tap. It always felt like it washed down some of the unease that crawled up my spine and sat in the back of my throat, if only temporarily. I sat back down and tried not to fidget. They finally called my name, and I forced myself to walk into the first room that one of the nurses gestured to. I saw the same kind woman I spoke to at the desk pick up a clipboard with my room number on it. I hadn't even realized that the three women milling around the desk were multitasking as both secretaries and nurses. She walked into the room, shutting the door and glancing at me with a smile. I began my rehearsed lines. "Hey, I'm afraid of needles, and I might look away. I might cry too," was left unsaid. I already felt my eyes welling up, and I willed it away, keeping my jaw tight and breathing through my nose. "Oh dear, it's all right. Is there anything I can do to help?" She chose not to address the tear that slipped out and down my cheek. How polite. "Not really. This always happens. Don't tell me what you're doing or when you're doing it. Just get it over with and I'll be okay," I replied tersely, the emotion and anxiety choking me like I just tried to swallow a bagel whole. She nodded and handed me back my health card. I snapped out of my freak out a little as I grabbed my wallet and sat it out with my card on the table. I didn't look back at her, instead looking at one of the posters on the wall as she went through her motions. "Take a deep breath in." I clenched my teeth hard, but obeyed through my nose, tears slipping out as I felt the needle sink into my elbow. It took a few minutes, but I finally let out a shuddering breath as I felt her slip the needle out and put a cotton pad on. "All done." I finally looked back, and she smiled gently at me. I smiled tightly back, as my fear hadn't really subsided yet. I distracted myself by looking at the newly filled vials. Blood didn't bother me. She had 4 of them, and was sticking on some labels with my information. I was surprised how quickly those 4 vials filled up. I think the entire process must have only taken a few minutes. She instructed me to put pressure on the cotton, and after a couple more minutes, stuck a piece of tape over it. I stood up, and she said if I felt okay and not dizzy, I could leave. I nodded, my eyes still a bit red and puffy, but my anxiety subsiding. I thanked her and left the room, closing the door behind me as I left, keeping my head down, assuming she probably needed to do a bit more prep work before she took the next person. I was almost out of the building when I remembered my wallet sitting on the table in the room. I spun around with a sigh and trotted back to the lab, walking through the waiting room back over to the room I'd been in. I'd only been gone a few moments, so I pushed the door open. "Sorry, My gaze shifted over to the nurse, and I froze. It was the same nurse, but with crazed-looking, reptilian features. Slit yellow eyes looked sideways at me. A vial of blood raised to its mouth. It hung open, wider than I'd ever seen anyone's jaw ever stretch. A long, snaking tongue was inside the vial, blood dripping down. My blood. I let out a noisy breath and blinked. My wallet," I sputtered, blinking a few more times, as I processed the new scene with confusion. In a flash, it had changed. The nurse was back to normal. The vial was empty, and she had lifted it higher, one eye closed and the other squinting into it. She put it down, looking over at the table. "Ah, yes. I didn't see you'd forgotten it. Sorry, I thought I saw a smudge in this one. Have to keep everything sterile, right?" She smiled at me, serene. My mind was reeling, and I reflexively nodded, reaching over and grabbing my wallet, glancing slyly at the plastic tray that contained my vials. I tried to smile, but I'm sure my face was screwed up, baffled, raw and red. Thanks," I rasped out, hurrying from the room and shutting the door behind me. The other two secretaries were looking at me with similar, calm smiles. I held my breath and offered them what I hoped was a polite nod, flashing them the wallet in my hand that I hoped conveyed why I briefly returned. I resisted the urge to run and shouldered my way out of the building. The second my door shut behind me, I rattled out a terrified sob and hacked out a cough from holding my breath and clenching my jaw. I tried to slow my ragged breathing as I drove carefully home, eyes on my rearview mirror the entire way. When I left that first time, I distinctively remember 4 vials. When I glanced into that plastic tray as I left for the second time, I only saw 3.